This is Lucinda, and just before we get going with this week's episode, I wanted to draw your attention to the fast approaching early bird deadline to enter the Business Charity Awards 2025. These awards celebrate the brilliant synergy between business and charity, spotlighting the trailblazers, the innovators, and the game changers who are proving that profit and purpose can go hand in hand. The early bird deadline for entries is the 9th of January. Entering by this date will earn you a 25% discount on the entry fee, and you can find out more at businesscharityAwards.com. Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse, and with me are Emily Harle and Andy Ricketts, bringing you our festive retrospective of 2024.
In this episode, we'll be taking a look back at the big happenings in the sector over the past 12 months.
And to get us started, Lucinda is going to deliver our annual news roundup in the shortest time possible. Are you ready for this, Lucinda?
I'm ready.
Okay, on your marks, get set, go!
On the 1st of January, the kids' company founder Camilla Batman-Gellage died at the age of 61. The National Trust was found to be the country's most searched-for charity on the internet, followed by the Dogs Trust. A review of the Charity Commission's investigation into the Actors Benevolent Fund found unfair treatment of former trustees. Separately, police were contacted after 156 votes for the Actors Benevolent Fund's online trustee election were found to have come from the same address. And later in the year, Lloyd Grossman stepped down as chair of the charity after only 2 months, citing time constraints. The homelessness charity, the House of St Barnabas, closed. Oxfam dropped Barclays as a foreign exchange provider over its continued financing of fossil fuels. In February, a study found the proportion of people of colour working in environmental charities to be less than half the UK workforce average. Meanwhile, charity mergers were found to be at a record low. In March, the supermodel Naomi Campbell's charity Fashion for Relief was set for closure following an inquiry into 4 years of late accounts and conflicts of interest. The British Youth Council announced its closure after more than 75 years due to financial challenges. The government refused to provide it with emergency funding. In April, research found British Muslims give at least 4 times the national average to charity. Hospice UK said hospice charities were facing a £77 million deficit this year, the worst for 20 years. Later in the year, it reported 1 in 5 of its members were cutting services. The London Marathon enjoyed a record-breaking year with £73.5 million raised for good causes. Legacy numbers also broke records with more than 38,000 wills, including gifts to charities in 2023. In May, the Copperfield founder Chris Hellenger died aged 38. 200 charities were set to lose their royal patronage after a Buckingham Palace review. In June, a whistleblower who was sacked after reporting a shisha cave at the Human Relief Foundation offices received over £40,000 in compensation. Central government grants to charities fell by a third in real terms. In July, David Holdsworth became the Charity Commission's new chief executive. Captain Tom's daughter and son-in-law were banned from being charity trustees for 10 and 8 years respectively. Stephanie Peacock was confirmed as the Charities Minister after Labour's landslide victory. Charities including the National Churches Trust and the Journalists Charity cut ties with former BBC presenter Hugh Edwards after he pleaded guilty to making indecent images of children. In August, the offices of Citizens Advice Sunderland were badly damaged by fire during racist and Islamophobic rioting. Alzheimer's Society relaunched its Long Goodbye campaign after the Advertising Standards Agency ruled the charity did not break any rules, despite receiving more than 230 complaints that the adverts were distressing. Also in September, the adventure charity Calvert Exmoor was saved from closure after an emergency appeal raised more than £500,000. Naomi Campbell was disqualified from being a charity trustee for 5 years after the regulator found her charity mentioned earlier in the year spent less than 9% of its total expenditure on charitable grants. The charity had also falsely claimed a fundraising partnership with UNICEF UK. Charity whistleblowing reports were up to the highest levels since figures were published in 2015. Research found people between aged 18 and 34 gave the most to charity out of any age group in 2023. A court ruled that a legal challenge by Kids Company against the Charity Commission could go ahead. 9 out of 10 mass event fundraisers hit their target in the past year. In November, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations estimated the national insurance hike included in Chancellor Rachel Reeves' budget could cost the charity sector £1.4 billion a year. The Charity Commission's inquiry into the Captain Tom Foundation heavily criticised Hannah and Colin Ingram Moore, finding they had personally benefited from the charity. In December, the government released figures showing volunteering had fallen to a record low, and Greenpeace donated £300,000 to the RNLI in a settlement with the oil company Shell.
Hey.
That was incredible.
That was amazing. And I think it just shows what a difficult year it's been.
Yeah.
Like there was a lot of stuff there that is tough and difficult, from redundancies to inquiries to financial challenges for charities. It's been a really tough 2024.
I mean, almost, this would be exaggerating, obviously, but almost the number of charities that we've reported closing this year could be a good 1 or 2 minute list in its own.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting as well is how much of this stuff will find its way into the public domain. You know, the higher profile cases that actually get reported on outside of our world of the charity business publication. I mean, I think, you know, the Captain Tom story is one great example of that. Obviously, that was hugely covered when the Charity Commission published its report in November. And it's those kind of things that are quite damaging for trust in charities generally, because the people who are against charities in the first place will see that sort of thing and say, oh, I told you I was right. These charities are all bent and everybody's just in it for themselves. Of course, we know that's not true, but it doesn't help the public perception.
Not at all.
Merry Christmas.
Now, let's go on to each of our top stories of the past year. You've heard the full list. Well, not really the full list at all. And I'm sure you're both going to come up with stories that were not included in that. But Emily, what was your top story from 2024?
So I've cheated a little bit here, and I'm talking about 2 stories because I think they are linked. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the British Youth Council. So the British Youth Council closed in March due to financial difficulties. That is a major player in the youth voice space, and it hosts a number of programmes, including the UK Youth Parliament. The UK Youth Parliament was later taken on by the National Youth Agency, but its closure still was a pretty big shock to the sector. And to me personally, I was a member of the UK Youth Parliament's Scottish counterpart, the Scottish Youth Parliament, for a period of about 5 years. And closures like this really worry me. Youth voice organisations are often chronically underfunded, but they play a major role in developing political consciousness and engagement among young people, something that we desperately need, especially right now. And then more recently, we also saw the National Citizen Service close its doors as Labour announced its new youth strategy. And so the reason I'm grouping these 2 together is because they're both major players in the youth work, youth voice space. And they do a great deal to bring young people together at a time where there's so much division across the country in terms of political views, etc. And with the National Citizen Service, there was a lot of mixed reactions. Some people thought the money could be put to better use and that the National Youth Strategy announced by Labour will potentially do this. But some people were saying that closing it rather than repurposing it was a really major misstep, and that the new strategy actually amounts to a cut to youth work in real terms, which I did delve into a little bit in a longer feature, so people can give that a read if they are interested. We don't know exactly where this National Youth Strategy will go, but we do know that grassroots organisations without that NCS funding are going to struggle, and a lot of them may only be delivering NCS and a couple of other programmes, so it could hit them quite hard. So the reason this is so important to me is because this new youth strategy presents a shift in how youth work organisations are going to be funded here on out and what type of youth work is going to be funded. And it's something that is a constantly developing story. And I think it's something we'll get a lot more clarity on in the coming year.
The impending closure of the NCS is really interesting because obviously that's had quite a lot of backlash in its early days, 10 years ago when it was first announced by David Cameron under the coalition government. It felt very much like it was a personal vanity project that everybody was thinking, well, why do you want to spend so much money? Because, they ploughed more than £1 billion into a service that was essentially just helping one quite small demographic of young people, wasn't it? It was just 16 and 17-year-olds. And initially, it was just, you can do some experiences during your school holidays and then you can do a bit of volunteering. And that was kind of it. And it seemed very expensive. People were like, I don't think this is a very good use of money. It's quite interesting to see how the opinion seems to have changed. In this time around, there was not much people saying, actually, this is great because we can put the money to better use elsewhere because of this uncertainty around how the National Youth Strategy is going to look.
Yeah, absolutely.
Andy, what was your top story of this year?
Well, Emily's had a political slant to it, and I'm going to be going down that route as well. I mean, the change of government has obviously been huge, and Labour's relationship with the voluntary sector, I think, for me, has kind of started and ended the year. In January, I went to a church in central London to see Sir Keir Starmer, then just the leader of the opposition, present his kind of charm offensive to the voluntary sector, inviting them to be partners with what he hoped would be the next government at that point in creating a society of service, as he called it, where he wanted the public and the voluntary sectors to work closely together to help Labour reach their 5 goals. That went down very well, perhaps unsurprisingly. I imagine he was probably preaching to the converted anyway. And then obviously 6 months later, Labour swept to power, and we've since seen discussions around a covenant being formed between the government and the voluntary sector. That work obviously continues, but it'll be interesting to see how that actually plays out and what it will look like when it does finally appear, hopefully sometime early in 2025. The other thing that's changed, obviously, is everything to do with government approach to the voluntary sector. You know, we very much saw a quite difficult, maybe antagonistic approach to charities under the previous government. Now they've tried to be more sympathetic and working alongside the sector, but there's still already challenges that are being thrown in front of them, not least the national insurance increase, which you mentioned in your roundup there. The 1.2 percentage point rise in the employer national insurance contribution from April is going to put an estimated £1.4 billion onto the bills of the UK voluntary sector, which is a staggering amount of money, and twice what people were estimating the COVID cost would be when that first broke in kind of early 2020. So it's a staggering sum, and you're definitely seeing very difficult examples of charities in particular sectors that are getting hit very hard already.
Not least among them hospices.
Absolutely. I mean, they're also facing the prospect of having to increase wages because of the rise in national minimum wage, which is good news for obviously low paid workers. But it does create an extra challenge for the charities themselves because they've got to pay those bills.
Which leads very nicely onto my top story of the year, which was in February. The think tank NPC estimated that the charity sector is subsidising public service contracts by an estimated £2.4 billion. And that figure has stayed with me for the rest of the year, and hearing about the challenges facing hospices, for example, but by no means just them, hearing the appeal by Akivo and the NCVO on behalf of thousands of charities to the government when the national insurance increase was announced. Back in February, we were already in this horrendous situation, and NPC found that the average charity funds 35% of every public service contract. Now, that's just not sustainable. Charities obviously don't want to stop delivering these services because the reason that they exist is to do so and to help their service users, their beneficiaries. They see a great responsibility to do so, but it's simply not sustainable. They can't carry on.
No. And it comes back to that classic quandary that charities find themselves facing around public sector contracts, is that when do you decide to walk away? Yeah. And when does the margin or the amount that you're being paid get too small for it to be sustainable? And when you're financing it by such a large amount.
35%. And that's only going to go up then.
Totally, yeah. And it's not as if the pressure on the public purse is becoming any easier, quite the opposite. So that is a very bleak picture.
So those 3 stories were all serious. But perhaps we could move on to the strangest story of the year, which will hopefully bring a bit of lightheartedness in what is supposed to be a festive episode. Emily, what have you got for us?
In April, the food bank charity Trussell, then it was called the Trussell Trust, was taken by surprise after a mysterious website appeared gathering donations for the charity. But the website was using the name of Meghan Markle's lifestyle brand, American Riviera Orchard. It had the words forgiveness, permission, please donate to the Trussell Trust written on it. And it directed visitors towards a Just Giving fundraiser for the food bank. It's a bizarre story. People were donating thinking it was linked to Meghan Markle. Others were donating thinking it was linked to other members of the royal family due to mentions of other royals. Trussell had absolutely no idea where this fundraiser came from. So it ended up raising more than £24,000 at the time which we reported it, which the charity said it had to accept under the Charity Commission's donation guidance, because the website did clearly state that the donations were going to the charity, despite the use of Meghan Markle's brand name and references to the other members of the royal family. And I just love this idea that either a prankster or some sort of Robin Hood type of figure set up this page to either trick royal family fanatics or haters to donating to a good cause.
Well, speaking of anonymous donations, my pick of the strangest story of the year was the mystery cash donations given to charities in Bristol. You might recall in April, the RNLI Portishead Lifeboat Station received £1,100 in old £20 notes shoved into an envelope. Then in June, the Young People's Bereavement Charity, Winston's Wish, received another similar anonymous donation, no explanation, just addressed to the charity with all these notes stuffed in. In the same month, Bristol Autism Support received another donation of around £1,000. And then the Grand Appeal, which supports Bristol Children's Hospital, received almost £4,000 in 4 separate donations. And also not forgetting the Penny Braun UK Cancer Health and Wellbeing Charity received £1,000 in July. It's all good, this anonymous giving.
But where's all this cash come from? Has someone found it under someone's bed or something, like underneath the floorboards? Like always someone going and withdrawing £1,000 in £20 notes from their local cash point.
Well, they wouldn't be doing that because they were old bills. They were old notes.
Right.
So
maybe they were
secret,
found underneath someone's bed. And just someone decided to be another Robin Hood.
Yeah.
Because it was all in the Bristol area, wasn't it? So it was very much targeted to local giving. So there's obviously a strong suspicion that someone in that region is responsible. But to this day, we still don't know who is the mystery Good Samaritan.
I think it's brilliant.
We need more of this.
Andy, what was your strangest story of the year?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say strangest, but maybe most unexpected in terms of a development to a story that had already been rumbling in the public eye for a little while. Now, you mentioned in your roundup the Actors Benevolent Fund. Obviously, a very aged, well-established charity that gives financial support to people who are in that industry, who are struggling, and has been doing great work for more than 100 years. But they were at the centre of a big governance row that exploded over the last couple of years when a group of former trustees headed by the actor Penelope Keith said that they had been ousted, and that set in chain a whole series of events and claims and counterclaims, and what was a very difficult governance row and a difficult governance situation. But then when the charity was finally at the point of electing a whole bunch of new trustees, suddenly we hear that they have had to suspend the vote process because about half of the votes that were cast in this election were found to be invalid. And of the something like 300 or 400 votes that came in, 156 of them came from the same IP address, which is just extraordinary. How has this happened? Who was doing it? How did they manage to get 156 votes from one place? It was quite crazy. So that obviously meant that they had to try again with that process. Thankfully, they have been able to successfully appoint a new board. And in fact, Emily, you subsequently interviewed Alison Wyman, didn't you, the chief executive, some weeks later when all this had settled down?
Yes. I mean, it seemed that Alison was very focused on moving the charity into a new direction with the new board. They've got the joint chairs, Alex McQueen and Hannah Whittingham. The focus is very much on the future. But I have to say that those 156 votes coming from one IP address, that's got to go down as blunder of the year for us, right?
But what's interesting about that story as well is that it wasn't just an internal feud. The Charity Commission were also pulled into it and strongly criticised for being unfair towards some of the former trustees.
Yeah, that was part of the whole backdrop. The previous set of trustees had previously complained that they'd been unfairly treated by the Charity Commission and effectively had their views just dismissed. The Charity Commission had done an internal review which concluded that actually, yes, they did have some valid claim there and they hadn't handled it correctly. Thankfully, the case is now closed and the charity appears to be back on track, so all seems to be well. But that was certainly not an expected bit of news when that broke.
Merry Christmas.
I'd like to ask you both about the trends you've observed this year. Emily, can we start with you?
So my trend revolves around social media. We've seen a whole host of charities quitting X due to its increasingly hostile nature since Elon Musk took control of the platform. We've seen many charities jumping on platforms like Blue Sky instead, which Third Sector is also now on. Charities that have quit X include Akivo, Children First, Refugee Action, all of whom said that it no longer reflects their charity's values and it's not a space where they can connect with their supporters anymore. But we've also seen charities making some much more lighthearted and fun content over on TikTok. So I wrote a whole feature about this, which people can check out, but it seems like some charities have really cracked the code to engaging with younger people on this platform and have been able to strike that balance between sort of unhinged Gen Z content. I'm using the word unhinged and we'll get to that in a second, but it's also been very informative. So if you look at the RSPB, they created this bird of the week content and all of their TikTok videos are amazing. I would highly recommend go and give them a watch. It's silly, it's fun, it is unhinged, and I will say that, but it's actually really informative and it raises the brand's profile, and that's something that they've done incredibly well, and a number of other charities have also done this too. In a year where we've already talked about all the bleak news that we've had, it's very refreshing to be able to speak to some people who know what they're doing on these social media platforms and are very excited about it and they're very engaged about it. And it's been incredible watching all of this, you know, silly, fun content. I hope they don't get offended at me describing it as unhinged brain rot, because I say that in the best and most Gen Z way possible. I think it's brilliant.
Andy and I both looking quite blankly at each other. I'm guessing that you don't share Emily's trend for your top one of the year.
No, I'm afraid mine is something more sobering, I'm afraid to say. But it's really to do with this financial background that we've been talking about. And there's been a consistent thread through this podcast so far. My trend is also a big concern in terms of the number of stories that we're seeing about charities making redundancies and people losing their jobs. Aside from obviously the impact on individuals, which is really difficult and very sad to see, the concern in the long term is that we're almost seeing what feels like a hollowing out of the voluntary sector in terms of the number of times that we're writing stories about charities having to cut jobs. I mean, just in the last year, we've written about big charities, including Marie Curie, Macmillan, the RSPB, all making big redundancies. But then also just recently, things like Relate going into administration, the central organisation of that. And I just wonder what that drip effect of not just the big job losses, but also the small scale ones that nobody ever hears about when you have a charity with 5 people and they go down to 4. We won't see the impact of these job losses potentially for some time in terms of what that actually means for the overall sector, because it's very difficult for us to get a sense of what's going on very much at local level.
Yeah. And it is invariably those smaller ones which are going to be hurt the most because they don't have the same sort of padding that the bigger ones do, even though they are also suffering.
Absolutely.
So let's try and bring this around to a little bit of optimism before we leave you for this year. Top learning from the past year. Emily, what's yours?
So my key learning is around systems change, which was already a really big keyword in the sector. But this year it seems to have gained a lot of traction and it seems to be mentioned at, almost every other event I go to. I think the riots that we saw in the summer, it really emphasised the importance of getting the right voices in the room when it comes to discussing racism, diversity, inclusion, and that includes those with lived experience. So when I've been out and about at events such as NPC Ignites, there has been discussions around certain organisations being left out of the loop during conversations with decision makers, even in the aftermath of the riots. So despite this sort of major event that brought to the forefront of the public eye an issue that was already bubbling underneath the surface. I mean, we've had this sort of division, this racism in the UK for, years and years and years, but the public was forced to confront it with all the reporting. There was a lot of focus on it, and it felt like a sort of real moment. The interesting thing is that even in the direct aftermath of that, some organisations are being left out the loop who really should be in the room. So when I was at NPC Ignite, Shabna Begum, chief executive of the Runnymede Trust, told delegates that some organisations have preferential access to government in these conversations. And to me, that just raised the point that the sector really needs to keep pushing and make sure that you're looking around at the same time as you're doing that push. You need to look around at who else is in the room that you're currently in, having these conversations, because if there's someone missing, you need to be able to call that out, and you need to be able to say, so-and-so should be here, whether that's a person, organisation, people with lived experience. It's really, really important that, you know, you're including everyone in this conversation, and especially the people who, you know, are the experts in this and they know what they're talking about and they want to be doing the advocacy work on that, because it's not enough that, oh, we've got one person in to talk about this, but they might not be the right person.
Well, I think that is an excellent call to action for the coming year in the sector. I think it's encouraging that these conversations have been happening and that they've been happening on public platforms, at these conferences and so on. But the push for that can't stop here. Now that's it for this week and this year. We'll be back with a fresh new episode in the first week of January with Wanda Wiporska and Polly Neat, the chief executives of Safe Passage International and Shelter. Thank you so much for listening to the Third Sector podcast this year. And for those of you who have sent in your feedback, it is always great to hear what you think. And in fact, a great Christmas present to us would be if you could find 5 minutes or less to fill in our survey. Details are in the show notes, to help us with our planning process as we enter 2025 for the episodes coming up. We would also love it if you would leave us a positive rating or a review on the podcast platform you use. It really helps us get the word out and have more people listening to us. So that just leaves me to say happy Christmas if you're celebrating, and if you're working over the Christmas period, thank you and the best of luck. Our producer is Nav Pal. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Wait.